They thought 30,000 feet up was the safest place to hide their dirty secrets, a sanctuary where no one could judge them. They were wrong. I did not just book a ticket on that flight. I prepared an entertainment program that the entire first class will never forget. When that plane took off, the iron cage closed, and I held the only key to escape. My name is Elena Vance. I stood in the center of our sprawling penthouse living room, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline was a jagged row of gray teeth biting into the overcast sky. The fireplace was roaring, the flames licking at the ceramic logs. But I felt cold. It was a bone-deep chill that the high-end central heating could not touch. The silence in the apartment was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure that comes right before a tornado touches down. Every piece of Italian furniture and every modern art sculpture seemed to scream detachment. We lived in a museum of a marriage, beautiful to look at but impossible to touch without leaving fingerprints. Marcus walked in right on cue. He wore that smile, the trademark expression that had charmed venture capitalists and graced the covers of tech magazines. He placed a heavy cream envelope with gold edges on the marble coffee table, right next to a small box wrapped in a deep red velvet bow. He came up behind me, his hands sliding over my shoulders. He smelled of sandalwood, crisp winter air, and the faint metallic tang of cold tobacco. He does not smoke, or at least, the Marcus I married 10 years ago did not smoke. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, whispering words that were supposed to be comforting. He told me I looked tired. He told me I had been carrying too much weight on my shoulders. He used words like healing and reset. He walked around to face me, picking up the envelope. He painted a picture of paradise. He had booked me a solo trip to the Maldives. He described a private villa over the water, a place with no cell service and no internet, just the endless blue ocean and isolated spa treatments designed to help me find myself again. He pressed the envelope into my hands, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that used to make my stomach flip, but now just looked practiced. He explained that this was our early 10th anniversary gift. He apologized profusely, saying that the merger with the Silicon Valley firm was entering a critical phase and he had to stay behind to steer the ship. He said he could not be selfish enough to keep me here in the gray city while he worked 18-hour days. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. It was a first-class ticket on a flight leaving tomorrow morning. My fingers tightened around the glossy paper. I squeezed it hard enough that my manicured nails dug into my palms, threatening to break the skin. My face, however, remained a mask of perfect, serene surprise. I had been studying him for a decade. I knew the cadence of his lies. I noticed the slight rise in his pitch at the end of his sentences, turning statements into questions. I saw how his gaze flickered to the bridge of my nose instead of my pupils. He could not hold eye contact with me for more than 3 seconds. Underneath his doting concern, there was a vibration of urgency. He was not giving me a vacation. He was shipping me off. I did not throw the wine in his face. I did not scream or demand to smell his collar. Instead, I softened my expression into the look of a grateful, weary wife. I smiled the way a lamb might smile if it could understand the butcher was leading it to the slaughterhouse and decided to play along. I thanked him for his thoughtfulness. I told him he was too good to me. As he pulled me into a hug, exhaling a sigh of relief that vibrated through his chest, the machinery in my mind began to whir. The gears of my revenge started to turn, slow and heavy at first, then locking into place with a terrifying precision. It was going to be cold, it was going to be calculated, and it was going to be sharper than any surgeon's scalpel. That night, silence finally settled over the penthouse. Marcus slept with the rhythmic, heavy breathing of a man who believes he has completely outsmarted the world. I slipped out from under the duvet, my bare feet making no sound on the plush carpet before hitting the shock of the cold marble in the hallway. I moved through my own home like a ghost haunting the ruins of a life that no longer existed. Streetlights from the city below sliced through the blinds, casting sharp, angular shadows across the living room. If anyone had seen my face in those brief flashes of light, they would not have found a trace of affection or warmth. The loving wife was gone, replaced by something hollow and hard. I sat down at his desk in the study. He never bothered to change his passwords frequently enough, but even if he had, it would not have mattered. I was the one who wrote the base security protocols for his company back when we were eating instant noodles in a one-bedroom apartment and dreaming of the future. He thought his private life was encrypted behind layers of corporate firewalls, safe from my prying eyes. It took me exactly 3 minutes to bypass the front door and access the hidden calendar synchronized to a cloud server he thought I did not know existed. The screen glowed with the truth, high definition and undeniable. There were the flight confirmations, not just one ticket for a tired wife, but 2 additional first-class tickets to the Maldives on the exact same flight. My stomach dropped. They were not sitting with me, of course. They had booked seats 2A and 2B, tucked away in a private couple's suite, while I was relegated to a single pod rows ahead. I scanned the passenger list for the second name. It was not a business partner or a client. The initials stared back at me. V.K. Victoria King, his director of marketing, the woman who had sat at my dinner table, drank my wine, and whom I had treated like the younger sister I never had. I expected to feel a sharp, crushing blow, but the pain did not hit me like a punch. It slid into my veins like a neurotoxin, slow and paralyzing, numbing every soft emotion I had left in my chest. It was not just the betrayal, it was the twisted logistics of it. He was not sending me away so he could cheat in peace back in Chicago. No, his arrogance was far grander than that. He wanted me on that plane. He wanted to walk me to the gate, kiss me goodbye, and watch me board so he could be absolutely certain I was contained. He wanted to monitor my movements in real time while he drank champagne with his mistress 30,000 feet in the air, separated only by a thin curtain and his own monstrous audacity. I inserted a flash drive and began the extraction. I copied everything. There were confirmations for an overwater bungalow that cost more per night than my first car. There were digital receipts for a diamond tennis bracelet and a matching necklace, purchased last week. Then I found the chat logs. I scrolled through months of messages. They did not just talk about sex, they talked about me. I read a message from Victoria calling me a boring old hag who had lost her spark. Marcus had replied with a laughing emoji, agreeing that I was just a placeholder until the divorce papers were ready. In the dead silence of the study, the soft click of the mouse sounded violent, sharp, and rhythmic like the reloading of a silenced pistol. Once the drive was safely in my pocket, I shut down the system and wiped the local access logs. I walked back to the bedroom and slid under the covers next to the man I had shared a bed with for a decade. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It baffled me how a human chest could house a heart that beat so normally while harboring such immense cruelty. I did not close my eyes for the rest of the night. In those dark hours before dawn, the Elena Vance who loved her husband, who trusted her friends, and who believed in happy endings quietly ceased to exist. The sun would rise soon, and when it did, a different woman would get out of this bed. She was cold, she was dangerous, and she was ready to burn it all down. The next morning required the greatest acting performance of my life, worthy of an Academy Award. I bustled around the bedroom, packing the floral sundresses and sheer cover-ups that Marcus liked to see me wear, playing the part of the excited vacationer to perfection. However, my primary focus was on a separate, sleek leather carry-on bag that I kept strictly within my line of sight. Inside that bag lay the tools for my transformation, the armor I would need for the war I was about to wage. I had packed a sharp, tailored black jumpsuit, oversized designer sunglasses that covered half my face, and a high-quality platinum blonde wig cut in a sharp, asymmetrical bob. It was a look that stood in stark contrast to my usual soft, long brown hair and cashmere cardigans. Marcus drove me to O'Hare, playing the doting husband until the very last second. He pulled the car up to the curb, unloaded my bags, and held me for a long moment. He kissed my forehead right in front of the sliding glass doors, his lips pressing against my skin with a tenderness that made bile rise in the back of my throat. I had to physically restrain myself from shoving him away and wiping the spot where his mouth had touched me. He looked me in the eyes and gave me his final instructions, telling me to turn off my phone the moment I stepped inside so I could truly disconnect and enjoy the solitude. It sounded romantic to anyone passing by, but I knew the truth. He wanted my phone off so I would be unreachable for the next 14 hours, ensuring I remained ignorant while he played house with his mistress. I watched him get back into the car and drive away. As soon as his taillights disappeared into the stream of traffic, my posture changed. I did not head toward the security checkpoint. Instead, I turned sharply and marched into the nearest family restroom. In the cramped space of the locked stall, I shed the skin of the obedient wife. I stripped off the pastel travel clothes and pulled on the black jumpsuit. I pinned my hair up tightly and secured the platinum wig. When I looked in the mirror, Elena Vance was gone. Staring at me was a cold, imposing businesswoman who looked like she fired people for sport. I put on the dark sunglasses, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. I walked differently now, my heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the linoleum. My first stop was the ticketing counter. I pulled out my personal black card, the one linked to the trust fund my grandmother had left me, an account Marcus had absolutely no access to and no knowledge of. I requested an immediate upgrade to first class. I did not just want any seat, I needed a specific vantage point. I purchased seat 1A. It was the single window seat on the left side of the cabin, directly in front of the pair of seats in the second row, 2A and 2B. Those were the seats Marcus and Victoria had booked. From my position, I would be able to hear every whisper, every clink of a glass, and every lie they told. But as long as I did not turn around, they would never see my face. Walking through the terminal with this new identity sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins that was more potent than caffeine. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and excitement, but my hands were steady. I felt powerful. I made my way to the VIP lounge and found a secluded seat in a dark corner, shielded by a decorative partition. I ordered a sparkling water and waited. 20 minutes later, they arrived. I watched through the tint of my glasses as Marcus and Victoria met near the buffet. The professional distance was gone. They were laughing, leaning into each other, and at one point, I saw her hand brush against his lower back in a gesture so intimate it made my vision blur with rage. Every secret smile they exchanged, every covert touch, was like gasoline being poured onto the fire burning inside me. It validated everything I was about to do. They thought they were embarking on a romantic getaway, but they were walking into a trap. I pulled out my phone, careful to keep the screen dimmed. I opened the encrypted messaging app I used with my legal team and typed out a scheduled message for my shark of a lawyer. It was short, brutal, and irrevocable. The text read simply, "Start activating Clause 9. I set it to send, took a sip of my water, and prepared to board the plane. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a world apart from the chaos of the terminal, a sanctuary designed for the ultra-wealthy to forget they were traveling at all. The space was bathed in a warm, golden ambient light that flattered the complexion, and the air smelled expensive, a mix of fresh leather seats and crisp, filtered oxygen. I was the very first passenger to board, a calculated move to ensure I was settled before the curtain rose on this farce. I walked straight to seat 1A, pulled the brim of my black hat down low over my forehead, and slid into the wide, plush armchair. I placed a pair of large, noise-canceling headphones over my ears, but I did not play any music. Silence was my ally now. I needed to hear every rustle, every whisper, every footstep. I sat there like a spider in the center of a web, waiting for the vibrations that would signal the arrival of my prey. 10 minutes later, The tranquility of the cabin was shattered. I heard her before I saw their reflection. Victoria's laughter drifted down the aisle, a high-pitched, breathy giggle that used to sound bubbly to me but now sounded like nails dragging across a chalkboard. It cut through the respectful hush of the other passengers. I watched them in the reflection of the darkened window as they approached row 2. Marcus was playing the role of the chivalrous protector, lifting her heavy carry-on bag into the overhead bin with an easy, practiced strength. As he brought his arms down, his hand did not just fall to his side. It slid down the curve of her back and rested on her waist, his fingers squeezing her hip with a casual intimacy that made my blood run cold. It was a touch that claimed ownership, seeing him touch her like that, so naturally and openly in a public space, made my stomach twist violently. I had to clamp my jaw shut to keep the nausea at bay. They settled into the seats directly behind me. We were separated by nothing more than a thin shell of leather and plastic, a distance of less than 3 feet. The proximity was suffocating. I could practically feel their body heat radiating through the gap. Then came the sensory assault of her perfume. Victoria had bathed herself in that heavy, cloying floral scent she favored, a mix of gardenia and musk that instantly filled the surrounding air, choking out the clean smell of the cabin. I sat rigid, freezing every muscle in my body into absolute stillness. I regulated my breathing, taking slow, shallow inhales through my nose, terrified that even the sound of an exhale would betray my presence. I was a statue, a silent observer in the shadow of their joy. A flight attendant appeared with a bottle of chilled champagne. I heard the soft pop of the cork and the fizz of the liquid being poured into crystal flutes. Then, Marcus spoke. His voice was not a discreet whisper. It was a confident, booming baritone that carried easily over the hum of the auxiliary power unit. He sounded euphoric. I heard him raise his glass and say, clearly and distinctly, "Here is to freedom. Here is to our future without the heavy burden waiting back at home." The words hit me with the force of a physical slap. I was the burden. 10 years of building a life together, of supporting his ambitions, of being his partner, all reduced to a heavy weight he was celebrating casting off. The sound of their glasses clinking together was sharp and cheerful, but to my ears, it sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell for my marriage. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. The massive engines roared to life, sending a deep, vibrating power through the floorboards that resonated in my bones. As the plane taxied to the runway and gathered speed, the force of gravity pressed us back into our seats, signaling that there was no turning back. We lifted off the ground, leaving the solid earth and the laws of normal society behind. As the seatbelt sign chimed above us, a cold, jagged smile formed beneath my face mask. It was not a smile of happiness, but of dark satisfaction. Marcus thought he was escaping to paradise, but he was wrong. As the landing gear retracted with a heavy thud, the trap snapped shut. We were now locked together in a metal cylinder 30,000 feet in the air, and for the next 14 hours, there was absolutely nowhere he could run. Once the aircraft leveled off and reached a stable cruising altitude, the entire atmosphere of the cabin shifted. The bright, clinical lights of takeoff faded away, replaced by a soft, amber glow designed to mimic a relaxing sunset. It was the kind of lighting meant to lull passengers into a false sense of security, the perfect cover for bad behavior to thrive. I reached up and subtly adjusted my headphones, sliding the left cup off my ear just enough to let the ambient sound in while keeping the noise-canceling feature active on the right. My phone was already positioned in the breast pocket of my jacket, which I had draped casually over the back of my seat. With a discreet tap of my finger, I activated the voice recorder app. The red waveform on the screen began to oscillate, hungry for the secrets about to be spilled. It did not take long. Marcus and Victoria were emboldened by the altitude and the free-flowing alcohol. They began to speak without a shred of caution, their voices carrying through the gap between the seats. They were not whispering sweet nothings. They were conducting a business meeting about the dismantling of my life. I heard Victoria giggle, the sound sharp and malicious. She mocked me openly, asking Marcus how he managed to keep a straight face when he handed me that envelope. She called me naive and stupid, laughing about how I believed he was slaving away in the freezing cold of Chicago while the two of them were sipping vintage Dom Perignon on their way to paradise. She spoke about my assets as if they were already hers to spend, debating whether they should sell my grandmother's lake house or keep it as a weekend getaway for themselves. Marcus joined in, and his words hurt far more than hers ever could. His tone was dripping with contempt, the voice of a man who had long since lost any respect for the woman he married. He told her not to worry, assuring her that I was completely washed up and oblivious. He bragged about his master plan, explaining that he just needed to play the role of the devoted husband for a few more days. He mentioned a power of attorney document he was going to pressure me into signing next week under the guise of estate planning. He said that once my signature was on that paper, he could liquidate everything, transfer the funds to their offshore accounts, and kick me out on the street with absolutely nothing. Every syllable was a poisoned dart, not only killing the last remnants of my love for him, but shredding my dignity into confetti. Then the conversation trailed off, replaced by sounds that made my skin crawl. I heard the distinct rustle of clothing being shifted and the wet, sloppy sounds of open-mouthed kissing. They were fondling each other right there, in a public cabin, separated from me by only inches of leather and foam. They whispered vulgar things to each other, their moans low and suppressed but audible enough to turn my stomach. The sheer shamelessness of it was staggering. They had no respect for the sanctity of marriage, no respect for the public space, and certainly no respect for me. My blood began to boil, a physical heat rising in my chest, but I forced my body to remain as still as a stone. I could not react. Not yet. I needed to be certain. I needed to see the beast in the light. Slowly, with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small, silver compact mirror. I flipped it open and angled it carefully, using the reflection to peer through the narrow gap between their seats. The image that greeted me was sharp, naked, and cruel. I saw Marcus's hand slid deep inside Victoria's blouse, his head buried in her neck. It was undeniable. It was graphic. It was the kind of visceral, living evidence that no high-priced divorce attorney could argue away and no judge could ignore. A wave of pure, acidic revulsion surged up my throat, threatening to make me gag. I wanted to stand up and scream, to claw his eyes out, to smash the mirror over his head, but I swallowed it down. I forced the bile back into the pit of my stomach and transmuted that disgust into cold, hard fuel. I watched them for a moment longer, engraving the image into my mind, and then I snapped the compact shut. I did not want to stop them. I wanted them to go further. I wanted them to feel so invincible, so untouchable, that they would dig a hole so deep they would never be able to climb out. I sat back, checked that the recording was still running, and waited for them to hang themselves with their own arrogance. I tapped into the airline's onboard satellite network. The connection was agonizingly slow, buffering with the lethargy of a dial-up connection from the late 90s, but it was stable enough to execute the most critical phase of my plan. I was not just browsing the web, I was severing the arteries of Marcus's financial life. I logged into our joint wealth management portal, the one he thought he controlled exclusively because he was the man of the house. With a few precise taps, I authorized the immediate freeze of our shared assets, flagging them for suspicious activity as per the script I had rehearsed with my forensic accountant. I moved funds from the accessible checking accounts into a secured escrow that required my biometric signature to unlock. He was currently sipping champagne paid for by a credit card that would be declined before he even reached the baggage claim. Next came the data transfer. I selected the batch of photos I had taken through the gap in the seats, along with the high-fidelity audio recordings of their vile conversation. I hit send. The progress bar crawled across the screen, pixel by pixel, carrying the destruction of Marcus's reputation down to the server farm where my legal team was waiting on the ground. The cold blue light from the phone screen cast ghostly, sharp shadows across my face. To anyone walking by the aisle, I was just a workaholic businesswoman catching up on emails. In reality, my fingers were flying across the virtual keyboard with the speed and precision of a concert pianist playing a symphony of death. I was composing his requiem in real time, ensuring that by the time his feet touched the tarmac, the legal summons would already be printed. Then, I turned my attention to the environment around us. I accessed the local intranet of the aircraft's in-flight entertainment system. Years ago, my software firm had identified a benign vulnerability in the media server architecture of this specific fleet, a handshake loop that allowed for local screen mirroring if you knew the administrative IP address. Marcus would never understand the mechanics of it. He was a big-picture CEO who could not code his way out of a paper bag. I did not hack the plane's navigation or safety systems. I was not a maniac. I simply established a bridge that would allow me to override the display output for every screen in the first-class cabin. I queued up my content, linked the devices, and left the trigger finger hovering. Behind me, the conversation had shifted from simple adultery to federal felonies. Marcus was now trying to impress Victoria with his financial acumen. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial tone, but the noise-canceling microphone picked up every syllable with crystal clarity. He began explaining the structure of a shell company he had set up in her name in the Cayman Islands. He detailed how he was siphoning off contract overages to wash the money before bringing it back into the States as consulting fees. He called it a victimless crime. I almost laughed out loud. He had no idea that every word of his confession was being transcribed and tagged for the Internal Revenue Service. He was handing me the nails for his coffin, one by one, and I was collecting them all. A strange electric sensation washed over me. It was a rush of pure, unadulterated power, more potent than any narcotic I could imagine. I held his entire future, his freedom, his fortune, and his public image in the palm of my hand, contained within a 6-inch glass screen. He was laughing, clueless and arrogant, while I sat inches away, holding the scythe. I glanced at the expensive Swiss watch on my wrist. We had exactly 2 hours remaining until our descent into Mail began. It was the golden hour. The stage was set, the audience was captive, and the curtain was about to rise on the most devastating performance of his life. The cabin eventually surrendered to the rhythm of the long-haul flight. The main cabin lights dimmed until they were completely extinguished, leaving the space bathed in the shadows of high altitude. The only illumination came from the tiny, pinprick reading lights scattered like stars throughout the darkened tube and the faint blue glow of the floor markers. The roar of the engines settled into a hypnotic, steady hum that acted as a white noise machine for the weary travelers. I turned slightly in my seat to check the perimeter. Marcus and Victoria had fallen into a deep sleep. Her head was resting heavily on his shoulder, and their hands were clasped tightly together on the armrest, fingers interlaced in a display of intimacy that looked sickeningly domestic. They looked like the perfect couple, peaceful and unburdened, while I sat awake, sharpening the blade of my resentment. Sleep was an impossibility for me. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and caffeine. I unbuckled my seatbelt with a soft click and stood up, moving silently down the aisle toward the lavatory. Inside the small, cramped bathroom, the fluorescent lights hummed with a clinical brightness. I splashed freezing cold water onto my face, shocking my skin into a state of hyper-awareness. I patted my face dry with a paper towel and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. The platinum wig framed a face that had hardened into stone. The softness was gone. The hesitation was gone. In my eyes, I saw a fire burning, a cold blue flame ready to incinerate the entire life I had built just to protect what was left of my dignity. I unlocked the door and stepped back out into the dim cabin. As I walked past row 2 on my way back to my seat, I made my first move. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, distinctive silk scarf. It was a vibrant pattern of teal and gold, a limited edition piece that Marcus had bought for me in Paris just last year. It was unmistakable. With a casual, almost accidental motion of my hand, I let the silk fabric flutter down. It landed softly, pooling like a puddle of water right next to Marcus's foot, dangerously close to where his shoe met the aisle carpet. It was a breadcrumb. It was a ghost from home. It was the first crack in the reality he thought he was living in. I slipped back into seat 1A and waited. Minutes passed in the semi-darkness. Then, I heard the sound of movement behind me. Marcus shifted in his sleep, his leg twitching, and then he woke up. I heard the sharp intake of breath. He must have looked down, groggy and disoriented, and seen the flash of teal and gold in the gloom. I listened intently as he leaned forward. There was the faint sound of fabric rustling as he picked it up. I could practically hear the gears in his brain grinding to a halt. He knew that scarf. He had spent $500 on it. He had seen me wear it a dozen times. He did not wake Victoria. Instead, he sat there in the dark, holding the piece of silk, completely baffled. I imagined him looking around the cabin, his heart rate spiking, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Logic would be screaming at him that it was impossible. Elena was in Chicago. Elena was crying in their penthouse. Elena was miles away. This had to be a coincidence. Maybe someone else had the same scarf, but the seed was planted. Doubt began to burrow into his mind like a parasite. He started scanning the cabin, his eyes darting frantically. I felt his gaze bore into the back of my head. He was staring at the blonde woman in seat 1A, trying to see through the seat, trying to make sense of the impossible. I sat with my back to him, staring straight ahead at the darkened bulkhead, and a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. Let him sweat. Let him wonder. The terror of the unknown was far worse than the truth, and I was going to let him marinate in it. The cabin lights flickered on, simulating a harsh, artificial sunrise that signaled we were 1 hour away from our descent. The flight attendants began moving through the aisles with the breakfast service, the smell of brewing coffee and warmed pastries filling the air to wake the sleeping passengers. It was the perfect domestic scene, peaceful and routine, which made it the ideal backdrop for the chaos I was about to unleash. I sat up straight, adjusted my wig, and unlocked my phone. I navigated to the device settings and deleted my generic username. In its place, I typed a new, very specific identifier, wife of the traitor in seat 2A. Then, I opened the file manager and selected the master document I had curated. It was a digital dossier containing the most explicit, damning screenshots of their text messages, the ones where they mocked me, planned to steal my money, and described their affair in graphic detail. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the share button. I did not hesitate. I activated the AirDrop function and selected every single visible device in the first class and nearby business class cabins. I hit send. For a split second, there was silence. Then, the technology did the work for me. A cascade of notification sounds began to ripple through the cabin. Ping, ping, ping. The sounds overlapped, creating a dissonant symphony of alerts that cut through the low hum of the engines. It sounded like a chain reaction, a digital contagion spreading from row to row. Around me, passengers began to reach for their phones and tablets, their faces glowing with confusion that quickly turned to shock. I watched as a woman in row 3 swiped her screen, her eyes widening as she read the preview. She nudged her husband, showing him the image. He frowned, read the text, and then they both turned their heads. Their eyes, filled with judgment and disgust, locked directly onto the couple in row 2. The whispering started almost immediately, a low buzz of gossip and outrage that grew louder by the second. Marcus and Victoria were still blinking away the sleep, completely oblivious to the fact that they had become the main attraction. They looked around, confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, until a man sitting across the aisle from them decided he had seen enough. He held his iPad up, turning the screen so it faced Marcus directly, his expression one of utter contempt. Marcus looked at the screen. I watched the color drain from his face in real time, leaving him as gray as the Chicago sky we had left behind. He was staring at a screenshot of his own text message, a message where he had called his wife a burden, displayed clearly on a stranger's device under the header sent from his wife. His hands began to shake violently. He reached for his own phone in a panic, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He knocked into his tray table, nearly sending his cup of hot coffee spilling onto his lap. He was frantically swiping, trying to understand how his private sins were being broadcast to the entire flight. Beside him, Victoria let out a sharp, strangled cry. She had just seen a compromised photo of herself appear on the screen of the teenager sitting diagonally from her. She shrank back into her seat, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her face burning with humiliation. The air in the cabin became instantly suffocating. It was thick with tension, heavy and volatile. It felt like someone had thrown a lit match into a barrel of gunpowder, and we were all just waiting for the explosion. The polite silence of the first-class cabin was gone, replaced by the collective fury of a jury that had just seen the evidence and was ready to deliver a verdict. Amidst the epicenter of the chaos I had created, I unbuckled my seatbelt. I stood up slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the cabin was already on me, sensing that the source of the disruption was about to reveal herself. I reached up with both hands, my movements unhurried. I lifted the heavy platinum wig from my head, letting my own long brown hair cascade over my shoulders. Then, I slid the oversized dark sunglasses down my nose and off my face. I turned around, a full, slow pivot, to directly face the two people who had just been tried and convicted by a jury of their peers. Marcus was frozen. His mouth was hanging open, a silent scream trapped in his throat. His eyes were stretched so wide they looked like they might bulge from their sockets, staring at me as if I were an apparition that had risen from the grave. He was not just seeing his wife, he was seeing the architect of his immediate and total destruction. The blood that had drained from his face moments before had not returned. I let the silence hang in the air for a beat, savoring the pure, uncut terror radiating from him. Then, I spoke. My voice did not shake. It was perfectly level, clear, and sharp, slicing through the whispers and the tension like a razor. "Hello, darling. It looks like your healing trip started a little earlier than planned, did it not?" He was paralyzed, a statue of disbelief. Victoria, on the other hand, reacted instantly. She let out a small, pathetic whimper and physically recoiled, cowering against the window as if she could melt through the plastic. She grabbed the thin airline blanket and pulled it over her head, a childish, futile attempt to disappear. But she could not escape the dozens of pairs of eyes now staring at her, burning with the knowledge of what she was. I took one step forward, closing the distance between us. I stood in the aisle, looming over them, my shadow falling across their laps. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it was a tangible force in the air. I was the judge, and they were the pathetic, trembling criminals in the dock. Marcus finally found his voice, or at least a fragmented piece of it. He started to struggle against his seatbelt, trying to stand up, his hands flailing. "Elena, listen to me," he stammered, the words tripping over themselves. "This is not what it looks like. It is a misunderstanding. I can explain." I did not even let him finish the sentence. I simply raised my right hand, index finger extended, in a universal gesture to stop. It was not a plea, it was a command, and the most amazing thing happened. He stopped talking. The entire cabin, which had been buzzing with excited murmurs, fell completely and utterly silent. Every passenger was holding their breath, waiting for the final verdict. I let the silence stretch for another 5 seconds, watching his pathetic attempt to formulate a lie die on his lips. "You do not need to explain," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost friendly tone. I leaned in slightly, and a smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile colder than the ice forming on the wings outside the window. "I have heard enough. I have seen enough. And thanks to modern technology, so has this entire flight. You have nowhere left to run. Marcus, you are trapped." Cornered, humiliated, and with his pristine image shattered in front of a dozen high-net-worth individuals, Marcus finally snapped. The mask of the sophisticated CEO evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a desperate animal. He lunged at me, his hand clawing through the air, trying to rip the phone from my grasp. "You set me up." "You crazy bitch," he roared, his face a grotesque mask of crimson rage and spittle. He was all primal violence, his logic and charm completely short-circuited. I did not even flinch. I just stood there, my feet planted, as the cabin crew, who had been watching the drama unfold, sprang into action. 2 male flight attendants and a large passenger from row 3 grabbed him. They wrestled him back into his seat with a grunt. He thrashed and cursed, a string of profanities filling the cabin, but he was overpowered. They pushed him down hard, and one of the attendants produced a set of plastic zip-tie restraints, securing his wrists tightly behind the chair. The transformation was complete. The powerful, charismatic tech mogul was gone, reduced to a pathetic, screaming mess, bound to an airline seat. Right at that moment, as if choreographed, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into mail." He paused, and his voice became sterner. "Due to a security incident in the first-class cabin, we have requested that airport authorities meet the aircraft at the gate. Please remain in your seats until the authorities have boarded." I looked down at Marcus. He was panting, his expensive suit rumpled, his hair matted with sweat. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I did not feel hatred. I just felt an empty, profound pity for this small, broken man who had gambled everything on his own ego and lost. The plane touched down with a jolt that felt unnaturally hard, a violent, definitive full stop at the end of our 10-year marriage. The aircraft taxied to the gate, and the moment the seatbelt sign switched off, the cabin door was opened, but instead of the ground crew, 2 uniformed police officers and my lawyer stepped onto the plane. My lawyer, sharp and immaculate in a linen suit, had been waiting at the terminal, summoned by the timed message I had sent from O'Hare. He walked directly to row 2, ignoring the gawking passengers. He presented a thick envelope to Marcus, who was still struggling against his restraints. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice calm and professional, "you are being served with a summons for divorce, along with an emergency restraining order and a court-mandated freeze on all personal and corporate assets." Marcus just stared at the papers, his mind clearly unable to process the speed of his downfall. I picked up my carry-on bag and started to walk past him toward the exit. I paused, leaning in just close enough for him to hear me. "Congratulations." "Marcus," I whispered. "The company, the house, the offshore accounts. It is all mine now. You should have read the fine print on Clause 9 of our prenuptial agreement, the one about infidelity and criminal fraud." Victoria was escorted off the plane by another officer, sobbing uncontrollably, her career and reputation already in ashes before her feet even touched the ground. I was the first passenger to step out into the jet bridge. I walked into the terminal and took a deep, shuddering breath. The air was warm and humid, but it was not the air of the Maldives. It was the air of freedom. I did not look back. I did not need to see them being led away. I walked confidently through the airport, the sound of my suitcase wheels clicking steadily on the polished tile floor. It sounded like the rhythm of a victory march. I pulled out my phone, deleted Marcus's contact, and opened the airline app. I booked a new ticket, one way, to Florence, a trip I had always wanted to take, by myself, for myself. I was finally whole. Thank you all for listening to my story. I am so curious to know where in the world you are tuning in from. Please drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on what happened. I would love to connect with you. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories and like this video. It really helps the channel. And if you want more people to hear this story, hit that hype button to support us.